Between 1887 to around 1914, over 60 works of fiction for adult readers describing hypothetical invasions of Britain were published. These works of fiction tantalized readers with the alluring fantasy that the Great British Empire, being subjugated and occupied, was not only laughable, but also extremely controversial. It is through these hypotheticals that created a kind of mythic fantasy that comes from a Western country being arrogant, that the threat of invasion and attack was impossible. Around 100 years later, it was American cinema that took a swing at creating such stories. Hollywood reveled in the same kind of mythic fantasies concerning invasion narratives, but now the theme was terrorism. From Die Hard in 1988 to Air Force One in 1997, or one of the most famous examples, 1996 blockbuster Independence Day. Like the invasion literature of 100 years prior, these action blockbusters were written, filmed, and consumed with the ideology of the hypothetical. And while the invasion literature of British Empire centered around Britishness, these Hollywood blockbusters created an image of the American identity, and when someone threatened this identity, they are abruptly stopped and thwarted by an all-American hero. However, when a coordinated attack took place on September 11, 2001, it changed everything, creating what philosopher Jean Baudrillard called the ultimate event. 9/11 changed everything, not just the way countries treated geopolitical acts of terrorism, but cinema as a whole, as overnight the invasion narrative completely disappeared. Okay, maybe not disappeared, but changed. A year on from Game of Thrones, I think it's important to go back and explore what made it special. However, I don't want to touch too much on what made the finale the way it was, but how the finale used 9/11 imagery in the penultimate episode. By exploring the visual aspects of how Game of Thrones uses familiar war imagery to convey ideas about trauma and destruction, we can see how using real-world parallels to highlight the human cost of the characters' actions can influence the way our own culture views those events. Using this analysis, I will explore how visual cues are meant to convey character development and the real-world implications of appropriating warlike visual imagery. Amongst the invasion literature of the 19th century, writer H.G. Wells cemented the evolving genre into the alien invasion with his 1898 novel War of the Worlds. The alien invasion explored powerful and unknown beings invading and destroying society's way of life. In media and fiction, a monster or alien is never just a monster or alien, but instead most likely to be an allegory to social or cultural anxiety. We can even see this in Game of Thrones, whether that's dragons representing nuclear war, White Walkers representing disease and death, and even the first children representing the oppression of ethnic minorities. Because of this, repetitive iconography helps audiences to familiarize themselves with archetypes and their representational value. So when you know X, which looks like Y, is bad, you know that X is bad. However, when narratives are trying to subvert expectations, X, which looks like Y, is bad, audiences are surprised when X is actually good. This repetitive iconography is the foundation that Game of Thrones is built on. Both in the show and the TV series, writers take identifiable imagery and subvert them. My favorite example is a Prince Charming that's not so charming. This is what made Game of Thrones excellent in subverting those expectations and conventions to the fantasy genre. Stylistically, many of Game of Thrones' fantastic moments come from moments we've seen before. The repetitive iconography doesn't just apply to characters and mythical beings, but can be found in action sequences as well. For example, the way the Dothraki fight in an open field mirrors the Western films of the 20th century, or even in Season 8, when Daenerys addresses her armies after the sacking of King's Landing. This shot completely parallels to the 1935 documentary Triumph of the Will. These same shots are used in several different media, from Lion King to Star Wars. From what we've learned through repetitive iconography, when the audience views a certain image that reminds them of a previous work, what the scene says visually can be told in the shorthand. And if Triumph of the Will tells us that Daenerys is an evil dictator, what do these shots tell us? And what can they tell us about ourselves and how we view the events that the scenes are based on? But first, we need to go back not to 2001, but a couple of years after, and see how Hollywood addressed 9/11. In short, they didn't. Writer and film essayist Lindsay Ellis wrote in Vox that the World Trade Center itself became a sudden elephant in the room for film and television sets in New York, and for the most part was quietly erased from the face of history. But although most pop culture reactions to 9/11 were passive, there were a few that actively addressed the tragedy, such as the October 3rd West Wing title Isaac and Ishmael, and the South Park episode Osama bin Laden has 40 pants. Action movies that utilized the mass destruction trope all but disappeared overnight. No longer was the bombastic and explosive visuals enticing, but they've now become distasteful and much too hurtful for audiences. However, with the release of 2005's War of the Worlds by Steven Spielberg, Spielberg brought back the 9/11 imagery to our screens. The terrorists weren't Islamic extremists we couldn't understand, but foreign fictional aliens we couldn't answer. And not directly referencing the event itself, Spielberg uses its images as a way to depict destruction. Ellis continues to write that if we trace the metamorphosis of our pop cultural depictions of 9/11 in the years that have passed since the tragedy, direct attempts to cope with the attacks eventually evolve into allegorical attempts. But the depictions of 9/11 have not slowed or even stopped, but merely changed shapes. Thomas Wrigler writes in his essay Mirroring Terror, the Impact of 9/11 on Hollywood Cinema, citing Alison Landsberg's recent work, that traumatic events such as 9/11 can be experienced and remembered via media representations and experiential sites such as cinema, rather than solely by people who were directly a part of the event. This in turn creates a prosthetic memory on American mass culture. And this has problematized media's representation, ultimately affecting the way that the culture remember these events, creating a kind of temporality that for those that didn't even experience 9/11 directly have some sort of pull towards it. We have a prosthetic memory that we all share told through the images of 9/11 and the fictional narrative surrounding it. However, because of this, media and Hollywood has tended to appropriate these images to convey certain messages. So enters Game of Thrones, and we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are they trying to say? And when using these images as a result of Daenerys' actions, we have to explore how we got here and why we got this. The justification of Daenerys' demise completely relies on how evil the writers can make her in the 11th hour of the show series. The roadmap of doing so comes from the very first scenes in The Bells, when Daenerys kills Varys for treason. The other characters take this as an unspeakable and unpleasant act. However, within the laws of its own universe, what Daenerys did was completely normal. Even when the standoff between Daenerys and Cersei comes, completely left field, when you think about the development both characters have had. While Cersei is portrayed as merciful for surrendering Daenerys, by contrast, she has to become maniacal to justify what happens in the very next episode. In fact, it seems that even the Second of King's Landing has to bend the rules of a well-defined universe to make sense. From the Siege of Storm's End to Harrenhal and Aegon the Conqueror, Daenerys' Second of King's Landing is completely normal within the laws of his own universe. But to show how extraordinary this event is, director Miguel Sapochnik had to rely on what is quickly becoming Hollywood's go-to trope for mass destruction. The United States launched its invasion of Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, on the 7th of October 2001. Alice writes, these military actions weren't just intended to exact revenge against an amorphous enemy, but to also spread freedom throughout the world, and one opposed them at one's peril. Two big concepts cropped up in patriotism-themed media: loyalty to country and falling in line behind the president. This almost totalitarian idea is the exact thing that mirrors Daenerys' arc in Game of Thrones. It was this idea that she could liberate Westeros from tyranny and enact a new sense of freedom, a new state that got her killed. The invasion from Daenerys echoes Western American imperialism. However, the visual cues of Sack of King's Landing goes directly in opposition with the visual mirroring of that of 9/11. The substance and the presentation are starkly different. So now that directors, writers, and essentially Hollywood feel comfortable enough to appropriate this tragedy and use it as shorthand to convey narrative arcs and character development. And the same way that Disney or Star Wars used Triumph of the Will as second-hand visual cues to convey the audience who the bad guy is, Daenerys and Game of Thrones use 9/11 imagery to show she's a modern-day villain without ever fully going into it or exploring this development. In Game of Thrones, Daenerys' narrative is that of the other. This is what comprises most of her arc throughout the series. However, in Season 8, Dany and her entourage are foreigners, not loved by the white Westerners. The Westerosees. Dany embodied the cultural other from her magic to her appearance, which is why going on to conduct 9/11 does have some dangerous real-life parallels of her not just as a woman, but as an immigrant. Because of this, 9/11 imagery can't be used as an allegory to 9/11 for several distinct differences within the episode itself. Yet, even with this in mind, there are still notes that I think are worth discussing. There are beats in the episode where different characters are supposed to be reeling from the tragedy of war and in awe of the destruction of what has happened by using slow motion and dulled sounds. However, these beats fall short when it's both Jon and Tyrion because, well, Jon up at this point has battled wildlings, executed a child, and has died at the hands of his own men. He can't be reeling over the human cost of war. And neither should Tyrion. Wildfire, anyone? However, the only time this worked in the episode was through Arya's point of view. Arya is the real point of contact for audiences to attach themselves and experience what is happening through the eyes of the people caught in the middle of the destruction. From the shaky handheld shots to long takes, we feel like we are right in the middle of the action. And through this, we see Arya take on the real character who had been caught on Ground Zero. Through her, we see human decency of people trying to help each other against the staggering odds. Writers for the slash film log state. Being on the ground with Arya and letting her witness the wrath of the Dragon Queen firsthand is a reminder of what King Robert said back in season 1. Men shoot themselves when they die. This is an ugly and brutal reminder, and people who didn't deserve to die are killed by tens of thousands. Not even Jon Snow can control his bloodthirsty forces when it becomes clear that the Queen is going to ignore the bells of surrender. This is exactly what we see for 9/11 and the prosthetic memory. That a terrible attack, the further and further away we get from it, the more and more it feels abstract and distant. This is the way that our culture assesses 9/11, that through the other countless events and global catastrophes, this one terrorist attack, which was known as the ultimate event, has become a shadow of what's actually happened. Jeff Rona posits, how can we hate Dany when our own country have done the same thing? But this is the problem. What is Game of Thrones trying to tell us? Is Daenerys a terrorist, or is she a Western oil lord? Are we wrong for supporting her during her entire run, the way Americans were wrong when Bush made his administration? But that's the problem. It doesn't ask us anything. As for the best part of 8 seasons, Game of Thrones never claimed to be a textual allegory for international politics, but about the human condition and what we are willing to sacrifice for power and love. So this very scene, this very episode, is not only superficial, it directly changed and shaped the way we view our own history.